Well, this is officially the oldest movie that I've covered in this series so far. On the Waterfront is pretty widely considered a classic, and I have no problem with that status. Marlon Brando's performance in this was pretty groundbreaking, and it's no wonder that it shot him into being the icon that he is now. Despite its very 1950s sensibilities, the story felt pretty ahead of its time in a lot of ways, being one of the first true mafia movies and shining a light on corruption that very few movies beforehand had even dared to delve into. There was an element that pulled me out of the experience quite a bit though. The music. Now, I'm no music expert, so I really only comment on the music when it's either exceptionally great or there's something pretty egregious about it. The use of music itself is pretty solid. A lot of the movie takes place without music, but when it is used, it's blared to a ridiculous degree. That might have just been part of the practice at the time, or there might not have been much that they could really do about it, but when it was used over top of dialogue, I was more or less lip reading because the music was just drowning out the characters. Even the iconic "I could have been a contender" scene has that effect just a little bit. Anyway, despite some distracting elements, I really liked this. It might not necessarily be a favorite of mine, but I can definitely see why it had the impact that it did. 8 out of 10. Repo Man. This was a recommendation from my dad. It's a 80s cult classic, and I have to say that it is an experience all its own. It has a unique sense of humor mixed with an extremely 80s punk aesthetic and a dash of sci-fi thrown in. There were a number of standout moments near the start and the end that I thought were really great, but ultimately I couldn't really connect with this one. A lot of the performances were clearly meant to be a little over the top and tropey, but it was really hit or miss with its effectiveness. There were a lot of times where characters' actions were more or less just weird for the sake of being different, and it also kind of feels like it might be a multiple watch movie, which a lot of my favorites are, but the difference between this and something like, say, Synecdoche, New York, is the fact that on the first watch there was something that really grabbed me and made me want to revisit it, which I don't know if I'll want to do for a while with Repo Man. I see the appeal, it got its point across really well, and it deservedly has its following, but this is just one of those movies where all these colliding elements just added up to something that I really just couldn't get into. 6 out of 10. Shang-Chi. This is the latest MCU movie, and I really enjoyed it. This brought more of a sense of style to the series, with most of the action being really martial arts oriented, clearly with some inspiration from Jackie Chan or Jet Li movies. I couldn't say for sure, but it seemed like Simu Liu did a lot of his own stunts for this as well, which is pretty refreshing for a big blockbuster like this. I would say the big thing that bugged me was what a lot of people are growing tired of with this series: the humor. This movie is pretty similar to Doctor Strange in that sense, because they both bring a new element to the series that's cool and fun to watch, but they also both have some of the worst humor in the series. I'd say the only other real issue I have relates back to the martial arts style, because for the first half or so I was having a blast with this more grounded, action-oriented story, and then later it blends in the martial arts with more fantasy elements, which were still cool, but I would definitely have preferred a more straightforward martial arts movie. One more praise: Awkwafina plays just the comedic side character in this. She was hit or miss, but I can't stress how much I appreciate the fact that she didn't have a forced romance with the main character. 7 out of 10. More of this, please. Stillwater. With this movie, I was more or less expecting another attempt at Taken from the description. I really don't watch trailers for movies anymore unless it's something that's just totally unavoidable, but I was surprised to see that that's not really what this movie is, and I like being surprised like that. All of the performances were solid, but I have to say that the structure felt just a little too Hollywood. Pretty much at any point, if you think you know where a plot point is going, you almost certainly do. The messages that were being conveyed felt just a little too heavy-handed as well. I walked away pleased, but I can tell that this one's not gonna have much staying power in my mind. This is fitting because Tom McCarthy also directed Spotlight, which is probably the most forgettable Best Picture win in recent memory. His movies seem to rely more on the commentary that they provide than the actual filmmaking or storytelling themselves. That's a big reason why I'm struggling to say much of substance about this movie right now. 5 out of 10. The Suicide Squad. This is from James Gunn, who's best known for making the Guardians of the Galaxy movies in the MCU, and the best way I could describe why I liked The Suicide Squad is because it made a lot of decisions that really fit the tone that it's going for, such as the R rating and making the viewer feel as though there's actual consequences to what's going on in the plot, as the title would suggest. I can't talk about this movie without bringing up how much of a monumental improvement it is to Suicide Squad, which this is a direct sequel to. Basically everything that made that movie bad, the polar opposite approach was taken with this movie. Like, characters were introduced in a way that flowed naturally. The film doesn't look overly dark and ugly. It was stylistically pleasing instead of basically just yelling, "Please think I'm cool." The humor wasn't the most forced thing I've ever seen. Things made sense. I'd go as far as to say that it's the biggest improvement that a sequel has ever made to the original, which I don't know how bold that is necessarily, but I can't think of anything that would even come close. There were plenty of characters that I was surprisingly invested in, and it had a just general fun and energetic tone. I do, however, have one pretty big criticism, and some of you aren't gonna like me for this, but it's Harley Quinn. I'm sorry, but I don't like this character. I don't think she's funny. I'm not invested in her at all, and the way she's incorporated into this movie really drained it of a lot of tension because she's just off doing her own thing for the most part, and every time they cut back to her, it really felt like the movie just came to a screeching halt. That's the only big problem I have. In general, it doesn't really do much to change the structure of a comic book movie, but it really was still refreshing to see something that has a new style to it. I'm gonna give this one a strong 7 out of 10. Untold, Malice at the Palace. This is part of the Untold documentary series on Netflix. I haven't seen any other installments in the series, but this one just caught my eye, being a sports fan from Michigan. I know the infamous Malice at the Palace incident from 2005 pretty well. If any of you watching don't know what that is, look up some YouTube videos about it or something, because those do a better job of communicating the chaos of the moment than this movie does. Where I will give it credit is highlighting the coverage in the media after the fact, which was a little bit, how you say, racially charged, but there was a lot in terms of the structure of the interviews and who they decided to interview that was kind of out of touch. Like, if you know who Tim Donaghy is, you almost certainly know why he was probably somebody that you could have left out of the conversation. Keep in mind, I'm saying this from the perspective of somebody who already knew a lot about this incident. So I would be interested to see anybody's commentary who learned about this through this documentary, but for me it really didn't add that much in terms of new information, which is kind of ironic since the forefront of the title is Untold. 4 out of 10. Alright, so that does it for this really long recording session. I put in some man hours for this. I better see that subscriber count go up for this. I'm putting in work. I know you care a lot about some guy talking about movies and the work that takes, what little work that it does take, but give me some validation, please.